so you can hear me. And I just wanted to say welcome to esteemed guests, friends, and today's panelists, including those of you joining us online via Zoom, although I don't think we can see any of you this evening. Thank you for coming to today's event to launch the report of the Independent Delegation of International Lawyers to Honduras. That's titled Our Determination Outweighs Our Fear, Indigenous Peoples and Campesino Communities Fighting for Land and Territory. My name's Steve Cragg. I'm one of the KCs here at Dowd Street Chambers, and I'm also one of the ambassadors for Peace Brigades International UK. I feel really fortunate to open this event today, not only to support the delegation in launching their findings and recommendations following their fact-finding mission to Honduras in September 2025, but also because the work that the delegation has done through its report, which you've all got a copy of on your chairs, and their mission and what's to come is truly admirable. This is not the first independent delegation of international lawyers. As some of you may know, I was part of the first one that went to Guatemala in 2023 to assess the land rights of indigenous communities in Alta Verapaz, alongside colleagues from these chambers and legal experts from USA, Peru and Brazil. Also in 2024, a delegation went to Nepal to assess the transitional justice process, which again comprised of barristers from here and legal experts from Sri Lanka, Colombia, USA and Cote d'Ivoire. So the independent delegation of international lawyers that went to Honduras in September last year was comprised of legal experts from a range of different legal traditions and bringing their own insights into the situation in Honduras. Three of the delegates can't be present in London today, but they are joining us online, so welcome to them. They are Isabel Madariaga Cuneo, who's an independent human rights consultant from Chile. Isabel previously coordinated the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights rapporteurship on the rights of indigenous peoples. Next, Omar Gomez Trejo is an independent human rights and criminal law consultant from Mexico. Omar was the chief prosecutor of the Specialized Unit for Investigation and Litigation of the Ayotzinapa case at the Attorney General's office in Mexico from June 2019 to September 2022. Next, we have Daniel Zakiera, who is the director of the Climate Justice and Human Rights Program at the Due Process of Law Foundation from Brazil, who also will be one of our panelists for tonight's event, and who I was with in Guatemala as well. So hello to Daniel. Presenting on the panel in the room tonight on behalf of the delegation, we have Camila Zapata Besso, who's a human rights barrister here at Dowd Street Chambers. Camila is also a member of the executive committee of the Bar Human Rights Committee in this country. So why Honduras and why now? Honduras is among the deadliest countries in the world for people defending land and environmental rights. Indigenous and campesino communities continue to face serious threats, criminalization and attacks, with perpetrators often not investigated or punished and protection measures falling far short in practice. The murder of leaders is a recurring method used to quell the work of those defending communities. And some of those, the murders of Berta Caceres, whose picture is on the front of this dais, you can see. Juan Lopez, Ali Dominguez, Jairo Bonilla, and Roger Alexis Castillo Fuentes. 5 of the names, and they're just the tip of the iceberg of this violence, which has claimed hundreds of lives. The current context is also shaped by the ongoing state of emergency in Honduras. This has raised wider concerns about shrinking civic space, policing, and the impact on communities already facing insecurity, violence, and displacement. Political will to protect communities and defenders in the country remains stifled. Meanwhile, defenders continue to raise concerns about the gap between Honduras' international commitments and the reality on the ground, including continued impunity, preventive evictions, and the use of the justice system against communities defending their rights. The delegation's report produces a fresh analysis of the land rights of Indigenous peoples and campesino communities in Honduras. You'll hear from the delegation this evening and from 2 prominent Honduran women human rights defenders as well. But not only about the toll that defending land and territory has on individuals and communities, but also what must happen to ensure the land and territory rights of Indigenous people and campesino communities are protected. The report offers a detailed consideration of the intensification of the agrarian conflict and the criminalization of defenders and communities in Honduras. It sets out the steps that need to be taken by the Honduran state and indeed the international community in order to meet international obligations and court rulings, in order to combat impunity, strengthen the rule of law, and offer justice for grave violations. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand over to Charmaine Mohammed from Peace Brigades International UK, who will be facilitating today's discussion. And just to say finally that PBI has a team in Honduras that provides holistic protective accompaniment to defenders at risk, and they, alongside their colleagues here in the UK, helped their delegation with the logistics of their fact-finding mission, for which the delegation is very grateful. So I'm going to hand over to Charmaine now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that useful background to this evening's event and the broader context. So good evening, everyone. My name is Charmaine Mohammed. I'm the new director for Peace Brigades International UK. For those of you who don't know Peace Brigades International, we are a charity that provides protection and support for human rights defenders in the countries where they work, and for those who are facing reprisals and risks for the work that they're doing. And that's the work standing up for their own rights and the rights of their communities. And those risks are sometimes violent. We've been doing this in a manner of ways for 45 years in different countries around the world, and we offer protection and support in a variety of manners. For PBI in Honduras, PBI's focus has been largely on providing protective accompaniment to land, Indigenous, and environmental defenders, so that they are able to stand up to systemic violence, consolidate peace, seek justice, and reduce inequalities. Our team in Honduras also supports and provides protection to defenders working with LGBT communities and collectives. Part of the mandate of PBI UK's office is to mobilise global legal support for frontline activists, so that when human rights organisations and communities in Honduras requested a legal delegation to look at access to justice in the country, we helped make that happen. However, it's important to note that the findings of the delegation are entirely independent. So this evening, I'm delighted to facilitate this panel discussion about the report and its findings, and I'd like to give a warm welcome and introduction to our panelists. So first of all, Kenya Oliva is a Honduran human rights lawyer who has defended human rights defenders and communities since 2003. In 2020, she co-founded the Bufete Justicia para los Pueblos alongside lawyer Eddie Tabora, offering legal accompaniment to land, territory, and environmental defenders facing criminalization. Kenya has worked on emblematic cases involving the Guapinol, Retoka, and Punta Gorda communities. Secondly, we have Dunia Sanchez, who is an Indigenous Lenca human rights defender from Honduras and a member of the Civic Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, otherwise known as COPIN. Through her work with the organization, she supports community-led struggles for the defense of Indigenous land, territory, and natural resources, and advocates for Indigenous autonomy and collective rights. Next, we have Camila Zapata Besso, who is a barrister here at Doughty Street Chambers, where she practices in international human rights law. She was one of the delegates who traveled to Honduras and is one of the authors of the report that we are launching today, for which we are very grateful. And online, we have Daniel Sequeira, who is a Brazilian lawyer and the director of the Climate Justice and Human Rights Program at the Due Process of Law Foundation. He was also one of the delegates who traveled to Honduras, providing valuable expertise on business and human rights, as well as the rights of Indigenous peoples and campesino communities, and is also one of the co-authors of the report. So as well as you all in the room, we also have participants and some of the speakers online, and we're very happy to welcome them, particularly those who are joining online from Honduras, and especially Camila and Daniel's fellow delegates, Isabel Madriaga Cuneo from Chile and Omar Gomez Trejo from Mexico, who also jointly co-authored the report. So we're going to have a conversational style panel discussion for around 45 minutes before opening questions from you, the audience, both in the room, and also we'll take questions online, which will be compiled and addressed to the panelists at the end of the event. So online, you can pop your questions into the chat box at any time during the event. And then we'll close the event and there'll be food and drink here also at Doughty Street for people to have further discussions with our two visitors from Honduras and other members of the PBI team, and Camilla and Steve from Doughty Street. So general housekeeping, can we please have phones off or on silent, please? And we'll commence. I will also put my phone on silent, which I have not yet done. Okay. So, first question to Camilla. So, civil society organizations and affected communities in Honduras, they requested an international legal delegation visit to look at the agrarian conflict and how it affects Indigenous and campesino communities in particular. Can you explain a little bit what the key findings of the delegation were in this respect?
Thank you, Charmaine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us and for coming. So I was fortunate to visit Honduras late last year, where our delegation of international lawyers met with Indigenous communities, campesino organizations, lawyers, including Kenya, state authorities, European diplomatic missions to Honduras, the Office for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Honduras. The conclusions of our report are summarized in the executive summary. You can see that at pages 3 to 4 of the report if you want a brief overview of what we did and what we found. I start by saying that Honduras is the most murderous country for human rights defenders per capita in the world. Land conflict is at the heart of that violence. Land conflict has historical causes in Honduras, which I'm not going to go into here, but they're elaborated in our report. But those causes have now been exacerbated by business interests, rampant corruption, and a development model that sadly prioritizes business over the internationally protected rights of Indigenous and campesino communities. Non-state actors, who are often linked to powerful landowners, business interests, and organized crime, frequently enact land grabbing by violent means. We found that the perpetrators of these crimes are not being adequately investigated or punished by the state, perpetuating a cycle of violence and impunity. In 2023, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights concluded that the scale of violence in the Bajo Aguan region, which is the most violent region for land conflict in Honduras, and the lack of an effective response from the state amounts to the acquiescence, or at least the tolerance, of such acts by the state. We heard during our visit firsthand from a representative of the Public Prosecutor's Office that state authorities fear entering the Bajo Aguan region because it would be a bloodbath. But the problem is not just about the state failing to prevent these crimes from being committed. State failures are at the heart of the abuses. The national legal and institutional systems systemically fail to protect Indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, and informed consent, Indigenous and campesino land rights. There are serious shortcomings in socio-environmental impact assessments prior to development projects being undertaken. The state's cadastral system, so its sort of land analysis system, is incomplete, disorganized, and it does not reflect ancestral land rights. The state's property system is plagued by overlapping land title. That this situation has prevailed, notwithstanding numerous rulings from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, finding that the land rights of Garifuna communities have been violated, and notwithstanding repeat recommendations from the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which the state is yet to comply with. Crucially, and a focus of our report, is that the state authorities frequently prosecute and evict members of Indigenous and campesino communities at the behest of powerful landowners, agribusiness, and extractive companies for the criminal offense of trespass. Indigenous campesino communities are frequently accused of trespass simply for being on the lands that they have subsisted on for generations. The situation has deteriorated since the passing of Decree 93 of 2021, which defines trespass as mere presence on land, punishable by 4 to 6 years imprisonment, and crucially allows the police to summarily evict Indigenous and campesino communities without a court order. These prosecutions and evictions are based on mere complaints by third parties who purportedly hold registered property rights. And that is so even where affected communities possess colonial property titles or exercise continued ancestral tenure over the land. The decree has removed the Honduran civil court's exclusive jurisdiction to resolve disputes over property ownership, meaning that the criminal courts have now become the primary battleground for these intensely complex land disputes. Prosecutions and evictions are pursued by the state without adequately inquiring into these communities' subsisting land rights, which are often evident if you just scratch under the surface, and notwithstanding indicators that third-party property rights may have been unlawfully obtained. Since 2023, there have been more than 9,000 evictions recorded against Indigenous, Garifuna, and campesino families. The effect of these measures on the communities that we met with are grave. Communities who depend on their land for their subsistence are violently evicted by state agents without an opportunity to defend themselves. This leads to a situation of the most abject poverty and displacement and undermines their ways of life. They are subject to arrest warrants and reporting conditions for several years. One of the communities we met with was living on the side of a motorway opposite from the land that their parents had inhabited for generations with their children and young babies. Add to all of that the high risk of violence that communities constantly face for defending their land rights, and the situation is just intolerable. Land conflict has already claimed the lives of countless human rights and environmental defenders, most notoriously that of Berta Cáceres, a colleague of Doña Sanchez in 2016, and Juan Lopez in 2024. But those cases are by no means rare or isolated. We were devastated to hear that one of the defenders we personally met with in Honduras, Roger Alexis Castillo Fuentes from the Camarones Campesino Collective, was murdered while we were drafting our report. State protection mechanisms are just not working to prevent the abuses. Killings have continued despite the victims being subject of precautionary measures from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights due to the exceptional risks they face. The situation should be of the utmost concern to the international community. An investigation report published last year into the murder of Berta Cáceres concluded that the company involved in her killing had utilized funds from the Dutch Development Bank and the Central American Bank of Economic Development to commit land grabbing related to the Aguasarca Dam in Intibucá. Separately, in 2024, a US court approved a settlement agreement in a class action lawsuit brought by several land defenders against the World Bank's International Finance Corporation for financing the Dinant Corporation, a palm oil business conglomerate that has long been linked to violent abuses in the Bajuaguán region. The direction of travel indicates that things are going to get worse in the short term. It underscores the need for an enhanced vigilance. The approach of the new government elected at the end of 2025 and headed by the Conservative National Party has so far been to ramp up criminalization and evictions of Indigenous and campesino communities and to further reduce funding for state protection mechanisms. A current bill before Congress would, if passed, grant the private sector the responsibility for self-granting environmental licenses without conducting free prior consultation with affected communities. Our report recommends that the international community and multilateral banks prioritize the issues we raise in political dialogue and cooperation programs with the Honduran state. And that states dealing with Honduras establish mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence mechanisms for all companies with investments, direct operations, and supply links in the country. Companies must not be permitted to continue economically benefiting from human rights violations. I want to end by saying that it has been an honor for me and for my co-delegates who drafted the report to meet with and listen to Indigenous and campesino defenders in Honduras and their lawyers. That is so, especially given the exceptional bravery that their work entails. I am so pleased to be able to share this room with Doña Sanchez and Kenya Oliva. We are also fortunate to be able to hear from you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla. So I'd like to ask Kenya next a question. As a lawyer working in Honduras, you've been working on seeking justice for human rights defenders and communities affected by the agrarian conflict for decades. What's your overarching assessment of what the obstacles are to justice in the country, and what does this mean particularly for Indigenous and campesino communities, and where the delegation's findings fit into it?
¿Y cuál es la importancia de los hallazgos del informe?
Okay. Muchas gracias. Saludo con respeto a la Delegación Independiente de Abogados y Abogadas Internacionales y a todas las personas que hoy nos acompañan en este espacio. Como ustedes van a observar en este informe, el conflicto agrario en Honduras, en la región del Bajo Aguán, en donde han ocurrido más de 200 muertes a campesinos en las últimas décadas y solo del 2022 al 2025, 35 asesinatos a defensores del territorio y del medio ambiente. Esto representa uno de los desafíos más complejos y peligrosos para las organizaciones de derechos humanos en el 2026. A pesar de los intentos de las organizaciones de resolver el conflicto con distintos gobiernos y particularmente con el gobierno que recién salió en el 2025. Persiste la inseguridad, la falta de acceso a la tierra y la criminalización a defensores y defensoras. Esto configura un escenario de alto riesgo. Presencia de grupos de seguridad privada, sicarios que operan en las zonas de conflicto, desplazando forzosamente a las familias campesinas y atacando con armas de fuego.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the delegation, the International Independent Law Delegation, and to everybody who's with us here today. As you will see when you read the report, the agrarian conflict in the Bahuaguan has been one of the most costly, in terms of lives, with over 200 people having been killed in the recent decades. And between 2022 and 2025, then 35 land and environmental defenders have been killed in the region. The report demonstrates that this is the most complex issue for organizations today in 2026. Despite the fact that over various successive governments, then there have been attempts to resolve the issues there, and particularly with the last government that left in 2025, the situation continues to be one of great insecurity. Communities do not have access to land, and human rights defenders cannot do their work in peace. The presence of various of private security, of hitmen and other armed actors results in the forced displacement of communities and the use of arms.
Con la población indígena, uno de los mayores problemas es la falta de reconocimiento a la titulación plena de las tierras ancestrales. Las comunidades como los garífonas, los lencas, los misquitos y tahuacas, entre otras comunidades indígenas, sufren usurpación de sus territorios por parte de terceros. Y estos terceros son los proyectos mineros, hidroeléctricos, turísticos y plantaciones de palma africana sin el consentimiento libre, previo e informado de las comunidades. Es una causa constante del conflicto en los territorios.
So one of the major issues that Indigenous peoples face is the lack of recognition of their ancestral rights over their land. Indigenous peoples such as the Garifuna, the Lenca, the Mosquito, the Tawaka, and other Indigenous peoples suffer land grabbing by third parties. These third parties include mining companies, hydroelectric projects, tourism projects, African palm plantations, and all of this happens without the free, prior, informed consent of the communities.
Entonces, los mayores obstáculos para el acceso a la justicia en estos conflictos es la aprobación de leyes inconstitucionales contrarias a convenios internacionales de los que Honduras es Estado parte, pero quizá lo más grave es la falta de independencia de los operadores de justicia que responden de manera evidente a los intereses políticos y económicos en el país.
So one of the greatest obstacles to the access of justice is the approval of unconstitutional laws that go against the international treaties that Honduras has ratified. But even more importantly is the lack of independence of the justice operators who respond to political and economic pressures rather than abiding by the law.
Entonces, las reformas como la que mencionaba Camila del decreto 93-2021, que ocurrió a solo 5 meses de haber entrado en vigencia el Código Penal. Este decreto ha sido aprobado por el Congreso Nacional de manera inconstitucional para criminalizar y desplazar de los territorios a los campesinos y a los pueblos indígenas y favorecer a los poderes fácticos para endurecer las posibilidades que los campesinos tengan acceso a la tierra, a la vivienda y para decidir sobre su soberanía alimentaria.
And so in the context of the Decree 93-2021 that Camilla was talking about, this is an extremely dangerous decree that was approved in an unconstitutional way by National Congress. And this favors displacement of campesino communities and Indigenous people in favor of companies. It is denying the Indigenous people in campesino communities of their right to a decent housing, right to their food sovereignty, and their right to life.
Iguales para los pueblos indígenas a quienes los obligan a desplazarse de sus comunidades, rompiendo el tejido social de estas comunidades y de sus formas de vida, empobreciendo más a las personas y obligándolos a migrar dentro y fuera del país.
And to Indigenous people, they're forcing them off their land, displacing them, destroying the social fabric, removing their capacity to continue with their way of life, making them poorer and forcing them to be displaced both internally and to other countries.
Los hallazgos de la delegación significa para nosotros y para los territorios aquí mencionados la posibilidad no solo de elevar la voz, sino también que otros gobiernos y otros pares puedan instar o cuestionar al gobierno de Honduras para que respete los territorios de los pueblos indígenas, para que resuelvan los problemas estructurales como la corrupción en las instituciones encargadas de regular la tierra, e instituciones como las fuerzas de seguridad que atacan de forma violenta a las comunidades y los operadores de justicia a la hora de conocer los casos lo puedan hacer de manera objetiva e independiente.
The importance of the findings of the International Delegation of Independent Lawyers, not only it gives us the opportunity to raise our voice onto other stages, but it also helps gives a tool by which other governments and peers can question the Honduran government in its actions, can pressure the government to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, to resolve the issues with land, the structural issues with land conflicts, to clear the state of corruption, to force the entities responsible for land registry to sort out their issues there, to fix the security issues in the state, and to also ensure that justice operators, when they decide on cases, do it objectively and independently.
Por último, decir que existe la obligación constitucional de proteger la tierra de los pueblos indígenas y las tierras de los campesinos. La Constitución de la República de Honduras establece que debe protegerse con especial atención la tierra colectiva. Ambas poblaciones no están pidiéndole un favor al Estado, están exigiendo y necesitando el reconocimiento del uso o posesión de la tierra en la cual desarrollan sus planes de vida, teniendo la seguridad jurídica de su tierra, tienen la posibilidad para su sustento ejercer otros derechos como la vivienda, la alimentación y el desarrollo para sus prácticas espirituales y ancestrales. Entonces, este informe nos deja algo muy claro. Las comunidades tienen razón. Y frente a eso, la pregunta que nos debemos hacer todos hoy aquí es si debemos actuar y hacerlo rápido, con urgencia. Es urgente actuar para que en Honduras no ocurran más asesinatos de defensores de la tierra y el territorio, ni agresiones a los defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
And finally, it's important to note that the Honduran Constitution demands, it includes the obligation of protecting the land of both Indigenous peoples and campesino communities. It has special attention to defending the collective rights of these peoples. Indigenous peoples and campesino communities are not asking a favor of the government or the state. They're demanding that their rights are recognized, the recognition of their rights to use and possess the land where they can undertake their life plans, have the legal certainty over their rights to their land so that they can have a decent housing, they can produce their own food, and they can undertake their spiritual ancestral activities. So it's very clear from the report that the communities are right. And what we need to do today is that we need to act. We need to act now and urgently to stop any more land and environmental defenders in Honduras from being killed and prevent any more attacks against human rights defenders from taking place. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a detailed overview of the very difficult legal and policy environment that you're working in. I'd like now to ask our panelist, Dunia Sanchez, who, as an Indigenous Lenca woman, and through your work with COPIN, you've seen firsthand and experienced firsthand how defenders and communities are impacted. Would you be able to share with us a little bit about what the current context is like for you and your community, and what your experience has been in trying to seek justice for cases like that of Berta Cáceres and other defenders?
Muy buenas noches o buenas tardes para todos y todas. Qué gusto encontrarnos en este espacio y gracias a la invitación de formar parte de este lanzamiento de este informe, por la invitación también a PBI y los abogados también que forman parte de este informe. Me siento muy agradecida por encontrarme aquí, trasladar la voz de mis comunidades y principalmente trasladar la voz, ¿verdad?, de toda la violación a los derechos que hay.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm extremely glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to speak at the launch of this report. Thank you to PBI and to the lawyers from the International Delegation. So I'm grateful to be here, to be able to raise the voice of my communities, but also to be able to speak about the grave violations that we face.
Vengo de una comunidad del pueblo Lenca, de Río Blanco. Me siento muy importante aquí para poder trasladar, digamos, la preocupación, el contexto que se está viviendo actualmente para quienes estamos de frente, quienes estamos luchando día con día dentro de nuestros territorios, pues el contexto para todo defensor o defensora del territorio, pues está la situación muy difícil, saber que nos encontramos en un estado que actualmente pues vemos que va a haber mucha persecución, ¿verdad?, a todas las comunidades que luchamos por el acceso a la tierra. Aquí ya lo mencionaba pues la compañera también abogada Kenia Oliva, pues enmarcando muchas violaciones a nuestros derechos. Decir que justamente pues poder acceder o poder luchar por nuestro territorio pues se está volviendo como una preocupación constante a diario, porque es luchar por territorio, es luchar por la vida y también hasta entregar la vida. Entonces, justamente es nuestra preocupación constante, que sabemos pues que han asesinado compañeros y compañeras por defender el territorio, por defender, digamos, los derechos humanos para nuestros pueblos, y que es lamentable saber que solo por defender o luchar por nuestro territorio entregan la vida. Entonces, creo que es oportuno este informe, justamente para poner, digamos, un poco un punto central para ver esa necesidad concreta de poder luchar por la garantía de las obligaciones que tiene el Estado en Honduras.
So I'm a Lenca woman from the community of Rio Blanco. And it's very important to be here today to be able to express our grave concerns about the context that we are currently working in the fight in our fight for the territory on the front line, because the human rights defenders, the environmental and land defenders are facing extremely difficult times with the persecution that we face for fighting for our access to land. Kenya has already spoken as to different elements of the violations of our rights that we face in our daily struggle in the territories, because now the fight for life is something in which it's a fight for our life, for our livelihood, for our land, but it's something for which so many human rights defenders in Honduras have had to give their life for that. And it is lamentable that just for defending our land, for defending our rights, that so many people have been killed. And so I believe that this report is extremely timely to be able to see and to use it as a tool to ensure that the Honduran state responds to its duties and obligations to guarantee our rights and our lives.
Bueno, también es importante mencionar que justamente ya lo mencionaba aquí la abogada Camila y también lo mencionaba la abogada Kenia, pues justamente no son casos, digamos, está el caso de nuestra compañera Berta Cáceres, que es un caso muy, que resalta, digamos, la necesidad de la justicia y es algo muy importante para nosotros y nosotras seguir viendo esa necesidad porque llevamos 10 años de justicia y la justicia en Honduras pues no es una justicia verdadera que nos merecemos nosotros como pueblos indígenas o como organizaciones, pues enmarca mucho, digamos, el enfoque que tiene, digamos, la justicia en Honduras y lo vemos reflejado principalmente en estos 10 años de la búsqueda de justicia para nuestra compañera, pues que aún falta pues mucho por llegar a esa justicia y que pues para nosotros ha sido un reto y un desafío seguir caminando en esta búsqueda de justicia.
And also, this is something that both Camila and Kenya have mentioned. These are not isolated cases. Berta Cáceres is an extremely notorious case in which we've been seeking justice for 10 years now. But justice in Honduras is not true justice. If we look at the 10 years that we fought, there is so much still to do to be able to receive justice and to get justice for all the people who've been killed.
Bueno, decir que justamente hemos llegado, digamos, a una justicia intermedia, pero nosotros no quitamos esa mirada de llegar a una justicia muy importante, de llegar a la justicia verdadera que nos merecemos, principalmente llegando a los autores quienes pues estaban directamente, que eran los accionistas del proyecto hidroeléctrico Aguasarca en nuestra comunidad de Río Blanco y que justamente pues son quienes pues crearon la persecución constante y quienes pues también crearon toda la división del tejido social de mi comunidad y el sector y hasta llegar al asesinato de nuestra compañera Berta Cáceres.
So far, we've only got halfway with the justice. We haven't got the true justice that we deserve. We haven't got to the original persecutors, the shareholders of the Aguasarca company, which was responsible for the project in Rio Blanco. These are the people who were the source of the constant persecution of our community, the destruction of the social fabric of our community, and that led finally to the killing of Berta Cáceres.
Mencionar que dentro de las cuales pues seguimos con una incidencia muy importante y se logró en el año 2025 conformar un grupo de expertos internacionales independientes que pues el grupo es el GIEI, hizo un trabajo muy importante dentro de nuestro país para ver, digamos, toda la vinculación que tuvo el crimen de Berta con el proyecto hidroeléctrico Aguasarca. Entonces, decir que este informe relata hallazgos muy importantes y recomendaciones muy importantes para el Estado hondureño, justamente que pueda acatar, digamos, estos hallazgos, también estas recomendaciones que son muy importantes para poder seguir avanzando con la búsqueda de justicia para nuestra compañera Berta Cáceres y también para el pueblo lenca en general.
And so we continue to fight for justice. And as part of this fight, finally, in 2025, an independent group of experts issued a report that details the links between the crime of the killing of Berta Cáceres and the other crimes linked to the project directly to the Aguasarca company. The report details many findings and many recommendations for the Honduran state that the Honduran state must respect and must respond to. And this is something that is key to achieve justice for Berta and for the Lenca community more broadly.
Decir que justamente pues se han tenido diferentes actividades de incidencia para este informe, porque sabemos pues que el Estado hondureño no ha querido reconocer, digamos, estas recomendaciones del informe, y entonces pues es importante que toda digamos, esfuerzos internacionales, poder incidir, digamos, a recomendar al Estado hondureño que pueda acatar, digamos, como las recomendaciones que este informe hace. Al igual, decir que justamente, pues, este informe que han hecho los abogados independientes internacionales también en conjunto con PBI, pues tiene hallazgos muy importantes y recomendaciones muy importantes de violaciones a nuestros derechos. Y es importante también que este informe, pues también seguir viendo la manera de seguir trasladándolo para exigir, digamos, al Estado de Honduras que reconozca estos informes que han llegado pues a redactarse por abogados especializados, digamos, en reglamentos o estándares internacionales, ¿verdad? Que no son reconocidos por el Estado de Honduras, y que es importante reconocerlos, porque ya que en Honduras pues no hay como leyes acopladas a poder luchar y poder defender los derechos a pueblos originarios, como ya lo mencionaban aquí nuestras compañeras.
And it's so important to maintain the advocacy for these reports, because the Honduran state fails to recognize the findings of this report. And this is where the international community can come in, because they can pressure the Honduran government to respect and to implement the recommendations of the group of independent experts report, and then also in the context of the International Delegation of Lawyers that went with support of PBI, the extremely important recommendations they make too in relation to the violations of human rights that they saw in their mission.
Entonces,
and yes, because it's only then in that way that Honduras will. We need to find ways in which the rights of indigenous peoples are recognized against the backdrop of this criminalization that they're currently seeing.
Sí, entonces, como les puedo mencionar, pues para nosotros estar aquí y ver este lanzamiento de este otro nuevo informe, pues respalda más todas las violaciones que han habido en Honduras y pueden seguir habiendo. Entonces es importante poner, digamos, un punto central para que estos informes puedan llegar también a las autoridades, al Estado de Honduras, para que ellos vean la necesidad y la obligación que tienen de poder paralizar todos estos tipos de violaciones que hay a nuestros derechos como comunidades. Así que muchísimas gracias.
And so for us, the launch of this report is so important because it provides even more evidence and more support to verify the things that we're saying on the ground. And it's an opportunity to ensure and to pressure the Honduran state to listen and to put a stop to the violations that we suffer. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dinia. It's really, I think, powerful testimony about the direct impact on you and the communities you're working with about this current climate of violations and historical violations and impunity. I'd like to move now to Daniel Siqueira, who's online and was one of the delegation and one of the co-authors of the report that we're launching today. Daniel, would you be able to share maybe some of the key recommendations then of the delegation in light of this discussion today?
As Camila, Omar, and Isabella was also a member of the delegation, and I happy to be with you today. I hope this document can be useful for the fight of local communities fighting for justice in Honduras. Considering the findings of the report that Camila made an introduction and a very comprehensive, I would say, analysis of the main findings, the delegation called the Honduran state and the international community to address the structural causes of the agrarian conflict and put an end to the cycle of violence and impunity that prevails in Honduras. To achieve this goal, the delegation issued the following recommendations. To the executive and legislative branches of the Honduran state, we recommend the repeal of Decree 90/2021. That's the decree that allows for detention, of summary detention without court order, and also to reform the criminal and code and criminal procedural law to prevent the arbitrary use of punitive power against indigenous peoples and campesino communities engaged in the defense of their lands. To resolve inconsistencies in the records held by the National Agrarian Institute and the Property Institute through a national survey that identifies and delimits land ownership rights in a clear and objective manner. Honduras should pay special attention, I would say, to the demarcation of indigenous territories, bearing in mind that international human rights law prohibits the granting of ownership titles to private entities or individuals lacking cultural ties to the lands that belong to the indigenous people. Establish a tripartite truth commission to investigate gross human rights violations in the Bajaguan region. And this recommendation stems from a commitment made by the Honduran government itself to provide truth and symbolic reparation to the families of the hundreds of community leaders who were assassinated in the Bajaguan region. Restructure the national protection mechanism to ensure it provides effective responses aimed at preventing violence against indigenous and peasant communities and their leaders. A set of recommendations to the judicial branch to implement a special jurisdiction and for land and territory, ensuring that property disputes are resolved through agrarian or civil proceedings rather than criminal proceedings. Justice operators in Honduras must prioritize civil jurisdiction to settle disputes over property titles and refrain from issuing arrest or eviction orders against communities that have ancestral tenure or historical titles up until land ownership is resolved. To the three branches of the Honduras state, comply with the rulings of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, especially in cases related to the Garifuna people, and the recommendations of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, guaranteeing the demarcation and titling of ancestral territories. In addition, Honduran judges must exercise ex officio, by their own motion, of conventionality control to incorporate international human rights standards into domestic law. It means that they should interpret the domestic law and public policies in line of its human rights commitments through treaties ratified by Honduras. Finally, the delegation issued the following recommendations to the international communities and multilateral banks and companies operating in Honduras. Strengthen mechanisms for accompaniment and support to civil society organizations dedicated to defending the rights of indigenous peoples and campesino communities in the country. Incorporate agrarian conflict, criminalization, and violence against indigenous and campesino communities as a priority issue in political dialogue and cooperation programs with the Honduras state, giving priority to institutional reforms for the regularization and titling of indigenous territories and land earmarked for agrarian reform. Finally, establish mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence mechanisms for all companies with investments, direct operations, and supply chain links in Honduras, especially in the agribusiness and extractive sectors. As you may know, many of the companies that are involved in those social conflicts in Honduras are based in Europe and eventually in the UK. So we do believe that these countries should take their share of responsibility and act according to human rights standards on extraterritorial obligations. That is basically a snapshot of the main recommendations of the report. I hope once again that's useful for the communities fighting for their rights in the country. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Daniel. very comprehensive, and obviously the full list of recommendations are also included in the report online and hard copy in both English and Spanish. I'd like to also bring in Omar at this point. The report details a lot about the use of Decree Law 93 of 2021, and also it details some very specific cases that you investigated and researched as part of this trip and report writing. But could you maybe say how the broad concerns that you found and the broad findings that you found from the delegation, how that fits into the Honduran state's kind of broader pattern of behavior and treatment or towards Indigenous and campesino communities at this time?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, perfect. Great. It's good to see you again. Thanks to Dunia and Kenya. It's a pleasure that you be in this important event. Well, unfortunately, and I will be very specific in making some remarks about that. Just Kenya and the other persons you said that unfortunately the Honduras system has been instrumentalized to persecute those who defend land and territory. The criminal offense of usurpation is issued systematically against community members and the leaders with documented violations of due process, the right to defense, and personal liberty. Unfortunately, also, the public prosecutor's office activates criminal actions selectively, processing private complaints supported by money or political support with extraordinary speed, while ignoring those felt by the communities. So that's what we heard is probably one of the main findings that we had in the report. It acts without verifying the validity of property titles, even when ancestral rights protected by the ILO Convention 169 are at stake. And under the Decree 93, execute preventive evictions without judicial orders, which is really, really important to raise this issue because it's just the use of power of the criminal law and also the security structure, such as an army, police officers, just to destroy the lands or the houses or the communities. And also, this is without a judicial order, transforming the prosecutorial body, which is really important for the checks and balances in the country, to guarantor of legality into a direct executor of dispossession. So the decree eliminates the requirement of violence over intimidation in the crime of usurpation, which is probably one of the main reforms, and creates summary evictions based merely on indications and prioritize the criminal route over civil or agrarian jurisdictions. So violating important principle in a law, in the rule of law in any country, which is the ultimate ratio. So communities has been evicted through killings, destruction, and homes, crops, and belongings without a broader pattern of criminalization. So for this specific report and for the future in the country and with these new authorities in the country, it will be really, really important to the derogation of this decree immediately. And the practice of the public prosecutor's office, it should be changing to protect more the human rights of the communities, indigenous people, than the economical, unfortunately, privilege that the money and the companies in the country inside has. I would just leave it there and probably just open the discussion to be more detailed about this and other issues we just raised in the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think we've heard quite detailed and substantive presentations from the panelists. It's a lot of information to take in, and obviously there's more information in the report, but we would like to open the floor now for questions. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience, and if you could just identify yourself first and who the question is directed to, that would be very helpful. So, yes.
Hi, can I make the question in Spanish? Okay. Well, but first, everybody, my name is Ileana Licona. I am Honduran, and I'm a current graduate student in here. And now I'm going to proceed to do my question in Spanish. Hola, Kenia, ¿cómo está? La pregunta va dirigida hacia usted.
Ya.
Bueno, desde septiembre que visitó la delegación hasta hoy, abril del 2026, han habido cambios importantes, específicamente en el contexto político, y creo que es importante que se discuta específicamente en el contexto de Defensoría de Derechos Humanos, de qué manera impacta el trabajo defensorial, por ejemplo, el juicio político, el fiscal general que ha cambiado, la agenda del Congreso Nacional, y yo creo que sería muy importante hablar de eso. Y también lo que había mencionado de que a final de este año se va a elegir el nuevo defensor del pueblo o el ombudsperson y cuáles son las implicaciones para el trabajo de la defensa de tierra y territorio en Honduras.
Gracias por la pregunta y estoy muy contenta de encontrarme con una hondureña acá y que ha trabajado el tema de derechos humanos también en el país. Bueno, a raíz de la instalación de un nuevo gobierno ilegítimo, debo de decirlo, la situación se vuelve muchísimo más compleja. Y es evidente desde el momento que toma posesión este gobierno, instala un Congreso Nacional que su única agenda era aplicar juicio político para tomar el control de toda la institucionalidad. A pesar que Honduras tiene una sentencia, ha sido condenado por aplicar la ley de juicio político. Ya hay una condena contra el Estado de Honduras. Bajo ese contexto, desconocemos los defensores y defensoras la agenda de este nuevo gobierno porque hay un presidente ausente. Quien tiene el control de todo es el Congreso Nacional y día a día pues vamos viendo en qué nos tiene entretenido el nuevo gobierno, pero también nos preocupa la reunión del Consejo de Defensa y Seguridad Nacional, donde es un superpoder. En Honduras están todos los poderes y más de 20 instituciones del Estado que han decidido hace 2 semanas hablar sobre la seguridad jurídica de la tierra. Y esto va dirigido a los pueblos indígenas y a los campesinos, porque quieren, bueno, han concesionado el territorio a las empresas extractivas y a la agroindustria. Entonces quieren fortalecer o desplazar a los territorios hablando de este tema de la seguridad jurídica, desconociendo la posesión ancestral de las tierras, que también es un tema que se debe de hablar en Honduras sobre el derecho a la posesión que habla nuestra norma civil, pero todo lo estamos viendo a través del derecho penal, que ha sido la herramienta para criminalizar a los defensores. Y ciertamente nos tienen entretenidos en esto del Congreso Nacional, que en los juicios políticos, que nos hemos olvidado, por ejemplo, que este año se elige nueva Defensoría del Pueblo y seguramente va a ser alguien afín a este gobierno, porque tienen los votos en el Congreso, que es lo peligroso. Por eso no se ha derogado en el gobierno pasado el decreto 93-2021 y por eso han aprobado todas estas leyes y van a seguir aprobando las leyes a su medida porque tienen mayoría en el Congreso Nacional. Y seguro el comisionado va a ser alguien a su medida.
So firstly, thank you for the question. I'm also extremely... Oh. Sorry, could you translate the question? Yes. So the question... Oh, I'm very loud, I don't know. So the question is relating to the changing context in 2016, 2026 in relation to the recent elections and particularly in the context of the fact that there's sorry, it's been a long day. The political trials that have been going on, and then with the election of the new ombudsman that seems to be sort of like trying to be pushed through. So let's see. Yes, I'm very happy to have a question from and have met a Honduran woman also working in Honduran rights here today. So firstly to say, then we do not recognize the new government. It's completely illegitimate, but the election of this new government has made a very complex situation even more complex. And so, yes, as you said, then the National Congress, as soon as the new government has been formed, has started on this political sort of like cleanup, sort of like launching political attacks to replace all of the powers with people that they have chosen. And the president there's already been a conviction for having done that. And we reject the state of Honduras, and so we're saying that there currently isn't a president there. So it's the National Congress who's leading everything. Another thing that I want to talk about is the Council of Defense and Security, which is like this enormous superpower. It includes representatives from all of the different branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, along with 20 different state institutions. And they met recently and they have issued a resolution relating to what they call the legal security of land, which is something that goes directly and attacks the rights of indigenous peoples and campesino communities even further in their right to land. This aggravates the situation in which already where the land has been granted to extractive companies and agro-industry illegally, and it shores up these illegal titles and these grants, and makes it easier for them to displace indigenous peoples and campesino communities. And faced with this failure to recognize the ancestral titles to which they have a right constitutionally and legally. So instead of putting these things through civil courts or through recognizing these rights, they're using the criminal code to penalize and to criminalize human rights defenders in this context. And so yes, and so we also mustn't forget that yes, in the context of all of this and everything that they're doing, the election for the new ombudsman is taking place this year. Surely there's no doubt that they will choose somebody who is a supporter of the government. One of the reasons that things like in the previous government, the Decree 93/2021 they were unable to repeal it is because they didn't have enough votes in Congress. This government has all the votes in Congress, and so they can basically do what they want.
Okay. We have one more question.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Or a few more questions.
¿Algunas preguntas más?
Hello, thank you so much for all the presentations. It was really interesting to listen to you. I wanted to ask, what can the international community do about what is happening in Honduras? Thank you.
Una de las cosas que nosotros pensamos es visibilizar la problemática a través de los diferentes medios de comunicación a los que ustedes tengan acceso, pero también diferentes funcionarios y funcionarias del Reino Unido, por ejemplo, que de alguna manera puedan instar al Estado de Honduras, ya sea a través de la embajada que está en Guatemala, pero que también es para Honduras, a través del sistema de Naciones Unidas. Es muy importante que a través de las distintas relatorías de Naciones Unidas se pueda recomendar al Estado de Honduras el acceso a la tierra para los campesinos y campesinas, pero también recomendar el acceso a la justicia para los pueblos indígenas y el reconocimiento de los pueblos indígenas, la obligación de la consulta libre, previa e informada para los pueblos indígenas. Creo que esas son acciones que se podrían hacer y también mencionar el derecho que tenemos a defender derechos. Es decir, la obligación que tiene el Estado de protegernos para defender estos derechos. Creo que son algunas cosas que se me ocurren por ahora.
So from the international community, then one of the things is you can raise the visibility of the issues that we brought up today and that are in the report. You can do that through the media, but also through state authorities. Pressuring state authorities to then put pressure on the Honduran state to recognize our rights. That can be through embassies or through the special procedures such as special rapporteurs in the UN to pressure the Honduran state to recognize Indigenous and campesino access to land, to justice, the recognition of the obligation through Convention 169 for the free, prior and informed consent, and the duty that the Honduran state has to protect the people who defend those, to defend people's rights. So there are a few things that come to mind right now.
Sure, I'm mindful that we also have a number of people online and there's some few questions. So I'm just gonna go to the online questions. We have one focusing on accountability and the role of international actors. Does the report name the international companies implicated in violence against Indigenous communities in agrarian conflicts? And if so, what legal or advocacy pathways does the delegation recommend for pursuing accountability against those corporate actors? So maybe members of the delegation might want to respond.
So the report doesn't do the investigative work into looking at what the parent companies or companies with supply chain links or other dealings with Honduran companies, what those relationships are. And we recognize that that is a key area for further investigation. So working out precisely what are the international business links with companies operating on the ground that are involved in abuses. The widespread nature of the abuses indicates that in having business dealings in Honduras and with Honduran, for example, agribusiness or extractive companies, there is a need for enhanced vigilance because the risk of human rights violations in the context of those kinds of business operations are real and continuing. One of the main recommendations we've made to the international community in respect of legislating to prevent these violations is that states establish mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence mechanisms for all companies with investments, direct operations, and supply chain links in Honduras. We do not have, for example, in the UK, mandatory due diligence obligations that have been legislated upon. There's an ongoing campaign for a business and human rights law for that particular purpose. So in writing to your MP, joining the campaign for laws of that type, and pressuring for states to not just the UK, but also European states to enact legislation that will prevent those kinds of abuses in the future.
I'm just one more online, and if we have time, we'll come back to the room, but maybe this one for Dunia. So one participant online has said, the report documents serious violations affecting Indigenous and campesino communities, and yet we've seen examples such as the tripartite agreement for conflict resolution in the Iran, territorial regularization in Zacata Grande, and compliance with court rulings, where progress has stalled or become politically blocked. So what would you suggest and also maybe some of the delegations have ideas, but how do you build mechanisms that generate real enforceable commitments from governments rather than agreements that just remain on paper?
I'm going to pass over to Kenya in a moment, who I'm sure will have something important to say about this issue. But our delegation, of course, welcomes with open arms the establishment of the Tripartite Truth Commission into the situation of violence in the Bahwa Guan. It's trite to say that prevention of human rights violations depends on of finding out the truth of what has happened so far, recognizing it, in order that the state and society can learn how to prevent those kinds of abuses in the future. That process has not even begun in Honduras, and indeed the Tripartite Truth Commission that was announced relatively recently appears to, its establishment, its setting up appears to have totally stalled. I'm afraid that the success of those kinds of truth commissions depends on political will. We had meetings with parliamentarians on Tuesday, where one of our key recommendations to the UK state was to look at whether there are any potential avenues for the UK to provide technical expertise in respect of the Truth Commission, in the same way, for example, that the UK did in respect of the Colombian transitional justice process. But I'm afraid that without political will at the Honduran level, such mechanisms will not get off the ground.
No tengo como la respuesta correcta, idónea, porque realmente el panorama es muy desalentador y preocupante. Pero para no sonar solamente pesimista, creo que la alianza con diferentes organizaciones civiles y de derechos humanos a nivel internacional ha sido muy importante en otros momentos también duros y críticos. Golpe de Estado, por ejemplo, la crisis postelectoral en el 2017. Y han sido las organizaciones civiles y las organizaciones de derechos humanos que han logrado que otros gobiernos, y por qué no implementen algunas políticas de derechos humanos. La creación del Sistema Nacional de Protección a Derechos Humanos es una ganancia y una lucha dura de las organizaciones. Y por supuesto no la hicimos solas en Honduras. Estaban muchísimas organizaciones atrás de nosotros exigiendo al gobierno, mandando cartas al gobierno, a los políticos, demandando desde sus gobiernos o haciendo que sus gobiernos a nivel de Europa, Inglaterra y América estén exigiendo al gobierno el cambio de esas políticas. Y es como una manera de hacer que nazca un poquito de voluntad política. Aunque ahora mismo con las políticas de Donald Trump, que es quien ha colocado presidente en Honduras y que hoy mismo está diciendo que si el actual presidente no responde a sus intereses, lo va a quitar de la presidencia y va a volver Juan Orlando Hernández, el narcotraficante que fue indultado por Donald Trump en Estados Unidos. Entonces, pues, ¿qué les puedo decir ante eso? Denme ideas ustedes.
Because really, yes, the panorama is very concerning. But I'm not just going to be pessimistic here. The alliances that we form with civil society organizations and other human rights organizations have been extremely important in various critical moments in the past, such as after the coup, 2009, after the post-electoral crisis in 2017. And these organizations have helped to push previous governments to implement policies. An example of one of those wins was with the National Protection Mechanism and the law that supports that supported the creation of that. It was a hard struggle, and it wasn't a struggle that we did on our own. There are many people behind us, and they did it through letters to the government, letters to their government, other governments in the EU, in the UK, and the US that sent letters to our government to continue to exert pressure that ended up in the change of policies. This is a way that we can generate some form of political will. Now, at the moment, in the context with Donald Trump, who is the one who put our current president into the position that he is in, and who has now recently said that he will remove him if he doesn't do what he says and put Juan Orlando back in his place. So yes, the drugs trafficker who he pardoned, who was in prison in the United States. So yes, I don't know, the panorama now. What can I say? Give me some ideas on that one.
Hey,
Vale.
we're running out of time, but I'd like to just close the panel by giving the last word to Dunia. If she has any thoughts to any of the questions so far, or any thoughts on how more specifically the international community could support the Lenca community or support for the Berta Cáceres accountability.
Bueno, decir que justamente he tenido mucha experiencia. Justamente, digamos, he tenido bastante experiencia caminar en estos 10 años de justicia para Berta y vemos lo oportuno que es, digamos, la incidencia internacional. Es por ello que hemos logrado justamente avanzar, porque justamente sabemos que el gobierno de Honduras siente la presión internacional de que está en la mira de todas las violaciones a nuestros derechos que hay. Y principalmente eso ha ayudado mucho, digamos, en la búsqueda de justicia para nuestra compañera Berta Cáceres, y creo que es la manera de seguir haciendo incidencia internacional. Puede ser por redes sociales, puede ser por amicus, puede ser por cartas recomendando, digamos, al Estado hondureño que pues justamente hay comisiones internacionales viendo todas las violaciones a nuestros derechos que hay y que hay una necesidad de justicia. Eso lo veo oportuno para nosotros porque ya justamente como lo mencionaba la abogada Kenia, pues no nos satisface la justicia que hay en Honduras, sino que nos da una necesidad de que a nosotros más bien nos pone en inseguridad justamente seguir avanzando con la justicia para poder defender nuestros propios derechos, y que eso lo veo desde esa manera, y que también justamente hacer incidencia justamente en los hallazgos. Hay un informe y justamente que hizo el grupo, como ya lo mencionaba, del GIEI, y que hace recomendaciones cómo hay vinculación cuando crean un proyecto tan violento en nuestros territorios y que violentan, cómo para poder operar, cómo para poder concesionar nuestros territorios y cómo llegar hasta asesinar nuestros compañeros de nuestros espacios que lideran nuestras organizaciones. Entonces, eso vemos oportuno también que desde las sociedades civiles internacionales, embajadores y todo eso, cómo poder respaldar, digamos, esa incidencia a través de eso. Muchísimas gracias.
So I'd like to say that the case of Berta Cáceres, it's been such a long struggle, but it's also an example of how important international advocacy is. Because without international advocacy, we wouldn't have got where we are today with justice for Berta. The Honduran state, because of international advocacy, feels pressure from the international stage. And this is what helps us to continue. And so we need international advocacy to continue. It can be through social media, it can be through writing amicus, from writing letters to the government. But all of these things are needed to be able to put a stop to the violations that we suffer as Indigenous people, and to be able to seek justice for these violations we've suffered. So because justice in Honduras at the moment is not a given, we are currently attacked rather than being protected. And so advocacy for the report, like the independent group of international experts that serves to demonstrate the links between these private companies and how these private companies are granted our lands and then kill us on our lands in our space. This needs to be protected. We need international advocacy to continue to raise the profile of these things to show how we can support and get our rights respected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just to build on what Dunia just said, obviously an enormous amount of work has gone into researching and writing this report, but actually the work must continue. We have a lot of follow-up now to do in terms of advocacy. The panelists here today, we've already organised and they've met with MPs and FCDO this week to engage with the UK government and what the UK government could specifically do. But we also hope that you will also engage with your relevant MPs or political counterparts to raise the issues that we discussed today. More detailed recommendations and ideas are in the report. And also if you want to support PBI more, please look at the leaflets and contact us if you are looking for ways on how to support human rights defenders in this very important work. So finally, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming today and for everybody online for listening. I'd like to give particular thanks to Doughty Street Chambers for hosting this event today, and in particular also each of the delegates who contributed their time pro bono to go to Honduras and look at these issues and write this very important work. I'd like to give really heartfelt thanks to Dunia and Kenya for joining us this week from Honduras and for sharing their experience and giving such powerful testimony. And also to Bufeta Justicia para los Pueblos, Kenya's organization, who supported the delegation enormously on their trip to Honduras. And finally, to the donors who supported all of this work, the Law Society Charity, the Evan Cornish Foundation, the Environmental Defenders Collaborative, and again to Doughty Street Chambers. And then absolutely fundamentally, massive thanks to Sandra and the online interpreters for just phenomenal interpretation today, which has been greatly appreciated, and to Sandra also for the whole week of supporting. So for those in the room, we have some refreshments. Please do stay, talk more to us and our panelists, and be happy to engage more in this. And thank you also for everybody online for joining. The recording of this entire event will be posted online tomorrow, which you can also share further.